So I'm joined today by Sanford Lewis. He's at the Shareholder Rights Group, and he's going to tell us a lot about the kind of work he's doing through shareholder proposals and other kind of integrative tactics to kind of ensure that companies are behaving in a responsible manner. So thanks very much, Sanford, for coming on today.
Thanks, Patrick. Before I begin, I should say my normal disclaimer, which is that my comments here are my own. They don't necessarily reflect the opinions of my clients or even the members of the Shareholder Rights Group.
So you took the time to prepare some slides. I'd love to turn to them a little bit so we can tell our audience a little bit more about what shareholder proposals are, for those who might not be as
Sure.
familiar with them.
So, a shareholder proposal is basically a, a key opportunity for shareholders to engage with the board and management of the company as well as their fellow shareholders on a range of issues, and I'll get into examples of the issues shortly. But basically, uh, the proposals that I'm talking about are ones that appear on the proxy statement, and under SEC rules, they're limited to 500 words, and that includes whatever you're asking the company to do, as well as any supporting arguments that the shareholder wants to make. So, typical objectives of shareholder proposals that are filed, a lot of them relate to the governance of the company. So, really trying to improve the structure of the board and management in a way that they'll be more accountable to shareholders. A lot of proposals historically are filed on governance issues, which are those kind of structural issues. Who gets to vote? How much does their vote count? Is the chair and the CEO the same person, or are they different people? And what's really notable about these proposals is that a lot of these proposals are filed by a few small shareholders who actually have made it a point to try to improve the governance of companies. And these proposals um, get very high votes, even though they're filed by small shareholders. And it's made a big difference in best practices at companies in their governance. A lot of proposals relate to investors' risk management concerns, such as the vulnerability of a supply chain if it has, say, forced labor or deforestation in it, or physical risks of climate change. All kinds of risks that companies need to address that relate to particularly environmental and social issues. And then, sometimes the proposals are about shareholders looking at a company and not being sure whether they're greenwashing or not being sure if there may be, exaggerating the degree to which they are, going to achieve climate objectives, for example. And so trying to get the company to have a more complete set of disclosures on those issues so that investors can tell whether or not what they're saying is accurate. And then, a lot of shareholder proposals, and these days, it's particularly interesting, a lot of proposals are invited debate about to what degree would a company investment in an issue like diversity or climate change benefit investors on the long term.
Within the 500 words itself, do you have to almost make a case that, a certain issue is going to affect the company financially? You have to ground it in some kind of, financial remuneration of the shareholders rather than we just think it's appropriate to refrain from greenwashing.
I think making the business case in a proposal is a very strong advocacy strategy. It tends to get more votes if you do that. And these days, I think many of the investors that vote on them look closely to those kind of financial arguments of proposals like that raise very significant, material issues for companies that investors will recognize as a material issue and will often, weigh pretty heavily in favor of support for these kind of proposals. This year's Boeing shareholder meeting, there are proposals, item 4 and 5. If you read the language of the actual proposal, they both just sound like, tell us about the impact of diversity issues at your company. In different ways, they say that.
Hmm.
But one of these proposals, the first proposal said that Boeing claims it says in the background section of the proposal, Boeing claims it disbanded its DEI department, but this just seems like a PR ploy to us. And really, you just move the employees around in the company. And so you're not really getting rid of DEI. That's the concern of the first proponent.
Stepping back, the proposal was basically perhaps somebody on the conservative side of the spectrum saying, we worry that having a DEI department in this political climate is going to be problematic to the financial bottom line. Therefore,
That's
get
right.
rid of your DEI department. And it looks
That's
like
right.
you haven't gotten rid of it yet. It's just a PR ploy.
Item 5 says, okay, you got rid of your DEI statement, you restated your commitment, but you didn't explain how you're going to continue to meet the commitment because they still said that they were committed to a diverse and inclusive workplace, but given that you eliminated your DEI department, how are you going to fulfill that commitment? So two really, appropriate perspectives for investors of different sides of the spectrum,
Okay.
uh, raising. And, some people have said, well, you shouldn't have either of these proposals. You should just leave the company alone and let them, be like turtles, pull into their shell and ignore this issue.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a good solution. I think actually this is a really vital part of the shareholder proposal process to allow investors of different perspectives to debate the issues and provide a dynamic feedback to a company. Investors don't really generally support proposals that are truly an anti-DEI. Like basically, a lot of investors really understand the value proposition associated with a diverse and inclusive workplace. That's what the votes seem to show. So there's a lot of different rules about how a proposal can be excluded in terms
Yep.
of the mechanics.
Yep.
When somebody drafts a proposal, they have to make sure that they're not, tripping any of these kinds of exclusions. And we'll talk some more about few of these, but just to say that there's a long list. A shareholder has to hold at least $2,000 worth of shares for at least 3 years now, as a result of an amendment that tightened the rule actually in 2020.
Yep.
But if you're a larger shareholder, if you hold $25,000 in shares, then you only have to hold the shares for a year. And another really important limitation in terms of these proposals is that, by and large, especially environmental and social issues, you can't say DuPont shall do X. You have to say shareholders request, and it's understood that it's advisory to the company. So the board of management retains their discretion for most of these proposals, even if there's a majority vote. The SEC is a sounding board for companies saying that the proposal doesn't meet one of those rules.
Okay.
And so there's a whole process that's been in place for many years where a company will write to the SEC and say, this proposal violates Rule X. So the process is called the no action process. And what the decision that the SEC means is, would you recommend enforcement action if we don't include this proposal on the proxy, or would you not? And at the end of the day, they either say, we're unable to concur with the company's position, or we find some basis for saying that the proposal is excludable. I really want to talk a little about climate change related proposals. I'm sure you know of many companies that have set net zero 2050 goals.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
no, it's a big problem with respect to potential greenwashing liability, because if they're not doing anything to actually implement those goals, it could be considered greenwashing.
We've seen that your actual emissions are going up, even though you set the goal, as one example. I like, here's Nestle's example of a transition plan describing a clear pathway between the current goals and the future impact, in some form, asking the company to do that as an example of, the kind of shareholder proposal that can address these issues. The big question is, will the SEC let you ask for that? Before we talk about micromanagement, I wanted to remind you of the part of the rule that says that you should state as clearly as possible the course of action that
That's what I was curious about. Yeah,
right?
You're supposed to say
Right.
exactly what you want them to do, but you can't micromanage.
Right. But now the new staff legal bulletin says, but if your proposal seeks intricate detail or imposes a specific strategy, method, action, outcome, or timeline for addressing an issue, that might supplant the judgment of the management and board and might therefore micromanage. So, just going back, okay, clearly as possible, but not seek intricate detail, impose a specific strategy, method, action, outcome. So this is kind of a little bit of a catch-22, I would say, don't you think?
is that particularly because of the latest revisions to the interpretive guidance from
That's what
the
it is. This is
uh,
the new
this is the new
interpretation,
interpretive
and
guidance
this
for
is
what
going back to
micromanagement means. Yeah.
what previously the position that the prior administration had. So they did say that if you're asking for discussion of the feasibility
Yeah.
or the potential for a
Yeah, yeah,
particular
okay, yeah,
issue, that
yeah.
would not be
Yeah.
micromanaging.
So is there case law, so I'm a litigator, so I'm always thinking about case
Uh huh.
law. Is
Right.
there case law that provides interpretive guidance, and does that
Yes.
case law arise from like SEC enforcement actions?
Well, the most important case law is the staff decisions that are issued in this field, of which
Okay,
there's
so the
a
staff decisions are
library of
published then. Okay.
thousands of published decisions on particular proposals. And so we do the same kind of distinguishing between proposals, and try to like encourage the staff, and the staff wants to look, relatively consistent between the different proposals. And so there is, kind of a case law type argument, although it's not. The problem is they don't give a very detailed description of what their rationale is. They just say, we find some basis, we're unable to concur, and you have to like read the tea leaves in terms of what did the proposal say, how was it written,
Hmm.
what else did the proponents say that might influence that determination. So here's examples of proposals that they found this year to be micromanaging, and these are not. I would say that these are new examples of proposals
Okay.
micromanage that,
I
that were
mean,
found
the
that
one on the
previously
left
wouldn't have.
seems to be relatively prescriptive. So adopt
Uh
a
huh.
non-interference policy. That seems,
Right. That's right.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
Right. Exactly.
adoption of no, so
No
that's also
deforestation, no
adopt
peatland,
this
no
policy.
exploitation policy. Right.
Yeah.
Again, too prescriptive. So this first proposal was
Okay.
excluded as micromanagement. It
So
asks for
climate
a
transition
transition
action
plan,
plan describing how it intends to align its
its
operations.
operations with its own climate ambitions.
Okay.
So describe how you
Current
intend
and
to align
related
your own
resources can
operations.
reasonably achieve its.
Mm-hmm. But I have to advise a client now that wants to file a climate proposal, and I have to say, well, make it more like the one on the right, less like the one on the left. Last year, I think 40% of proposals filed by members of the ICCR, which is a large
Yeah,
coalition
yeah,
of
yeah. Yeah.
investors, were withdrawn because the companies agreed to do proactive things, and that's like one of the values of the process. So there was a proposal on one company's proxy asking the company whether to eliminate environmental and social proposals being allowed on the company's proxy statement, and only 1% of shareholders supported that
Yeah.
idea. So most shareholders say, yeah, no, we want to have this exchange of views. Efforts to roll back these rights really amount to kind of an attempt to insulate the board of management rather than recognizing this process as a keystone of corporate governance in the U.S. So I would say, it may be tempting to make decisions behind locked doors, but even with an issue like climate change or DEI, even in a polarized society, it's all the more important for a company to show how it's threading the needle between these different kinds of perspectives and how it believes it's producing long-term value for its investors, and not just looking at short-term profits that might benefit on the board more than its general shareholders.
If the SEC, gives a sense that they're going to allow it, then it goes to a vote at the shareholder
Right.
meeting. Okay.
That's right. And then the shareholder meeting, shareholders will vote on them, and they'll approve some proposals by majority vote.
Yeah.
But a proposal that gets a proposal on an ESG issue that is basically saying you're not doing well enough on climate. Let's say it gets 20% vote, and 20% of shareholders think that the company should be doing better disclosure on the issue.
Mhm.
That's essentially information for the board of management that a significant portion of their investors believe that that this is a material issue. That the reasonable investor of this company thinks it's important. A significant portion of the reasonable investors think it's important, and therefore depending on what it's asking for, they might say, yeah, we could probably address that better and address that 20% of shareholders that are raising this. In other instances, if you're asking for, fundamental change at the company and you have 20% of shareholders supporting that, then,
Yeah.
okay, then the majority vote really does matter.
Mm.
But to the extent that it's, an issue that a significant portion of investors think is important. I think it's really critical that 20%, 30% of shareholders could be enough to sway a company to pay attention to it. Now, there is also another outcome of voting, which is that if you get too low a vote, you can't bring the proposal back in a subsequent year.
Okay.
So a proposal that you present for the first time, you got to get at least 5% support. The second year, you have to get 15%. And the third year, you have to get 25%. 25% could be a pretty steep slope. So after 3 years, the proposal might need to go away if you can't muster that level of support.
So I really appreciate you coming on and educating our audience about this really interesting process.
So thanks for having me.
Great. Cheers.